versus standard edition as far as tuning goes. Because what you want to do is fill that database up with as many applications as possible. Now you've got a really hard tuning problem, right? Because you've got a lot more SQL to look at, a lot more things to manage and monitor. But you might have taken 10 databases and combined them into one. There's a huge cost savings there as far as licensing software. And if you can turn on the automated stuff at that point in time, you're free to do other stuff. This question made me laugh when I read it, because it's basically saying Aura 600 is a competitive advantage for Oracle. The fact that you have Aura 600 is a selling feature. And at first I scratched my head and said, that's a strange way to look at it. But the way they phrased it, it makes sense. Yes, it's bad that you occasionally get an Aura 600. But it's good that when you do, you create a large amount of information that helps us diagnose what it is. And the more you look at this, I'm like, yes, that makes sense. Aura 600, lots of diagnostic information. It's just like our $V tables. And Aura 600 is just as important, just as relevant as all of the $V tables the dynamic performance views are. Aura 600 stuff is just like SQL Trace, being able to look into our application and see what it does. If you look at the Oracle database source code, practically every other line of code is diagnostic code. It's not processing your query, it's printing something out in the event that something goes wrong, or it's counting things, how many times you've done something, so that you can tune the database and figure out where the bottlenecks are. So, in current releases, like 11G Release 1 and 11G Release 2, we've taken the Aura 600 stuff even a step further. There's a new capability in 11G in the form of the Advanced Diagnostic Repository, ADR. Now, when an Aura 600 occurs, not only do we create trace files, we create an incident. We store that in a repository. And you can package that incident. And by packaging that incident, it's going to find all the trace files related to it, the alert log entries that are relevant, any bit of information that it created during that incident that support is going to ask you for. And we package that up. And so that actually is a feature now. When we talk about 11G Release 1 and 2, we always talk about the ADR, the diagnostic repository that comes with the database now, and that is in fact taking an Aura 600 and turning it into a feature. So in a way, 11G has turned the Aura 600 into a new feature. So it comes with every release of the database. You don't have to pay extra for the Aura 600s. We just give those away for free. But we've made it easier to deal with them. When they do happen, we catalog it, we package it, and we make it something that can be used to open a service request immediately. Question number 5. ASM is mandatory for real application clusters with standard edition. Do we recommend it for other configurations? The answer to that is yes, definitely. Beyond standard edition, if you're doing clustering on enterprise edition, we would absolutely recommend ASM. Why is ASM mandatory on standard edition? Standard edition costs less than enterprise edition. Customers who are using standard edition, we would prefer that they do not call support. Right? We would prefer that they just install and have things run very smoothly. In order to do real application clusters in standard edition, you have to use ASM that significantly reduces our support calls. If you didn't use ASM, you would need to purchase third-party software, Veritas, for example, disk management software. Install and configure that. Get that working with the operating system. Get that working with the database. That's where support calls come from. Anybody who's trying to do that, they're going to be on the phone with support for 2 weeks going through the installation process. If, on the other hand, they use ASM, they're going to install the software and get it up and running in an afternoon because we've installed it thousands of times. You know that it all works together. You don't have to patch them to different release levels. There's no mandatory patches for Veritas and mandatory patches for the database. You just install. So the reason we made it mandatory with Standard Edition was to make it easy, to make it easier to install, easier to configure. The same is true with Enterprise Edition. Enterprise Edition, you have the option to use third-party software, but we strongly recommend against it in a clustered environment. If you're not going to use clustering at all, if you're just going to use a single instance of Oracle, you can use a regular file system or ASM. We would recommend ASM, but not in the same strength that we recommend it with real application clusters. If you just use a file system, you lose some of the manageability characteristics that ASM provides, but that would be your choice. You're not going to have issues with a regular file system with the database like you might with a clustered file system with real application clusters. So it's mostly a support thing. The other part of this question is talking about mirroring of data at the disk drive level. It says we usually use hardware mirroring provided by the storage. Do we recommend ASM mirroring over storage mirroring? ASM provides us two things. One is striping of data, and it's always going to stripe the data. So you're always going to use ASM to stripe information, even if your storage solution stripes information. And that's okay, because it's okay to stripe a stripe. If your storage solution provides some level of RAID, like RAID 5, and gives you no ability to turn that off, use the storage array to provide the redundancy. It's perfectly okay. You're going to get generic performance out of it. You're not going to get the best performance. But if it's going to provide the redundancy and you can't disable that capability in the storage array, go ahead and use it. If you have the ability to turn it off, we would recommend that you use ASM to provide the redundancy, because then you can set up at a very finely tuned level exactly what disks are used with what databases and what capacity. You have more control. You can set up your failure groups in a more logical way that makes sense for your usage with the database than if you just bought a bunch of disks in a box and they were all RAID 5 striped. And you can break it up, be more fine-grained with it. So, the general recommendation would be, if you can let ASM do the redundancy, go ahead and let it do it there. If you can't, that's okay. It just might not perform as well as it could if you were doing it yourself. Another question, and this one pops up frequently, is there's this new NoSQL movement out there. So people are saying, oh, SQL is bad, SQL doesn't scale, relational databases are dead. And it seems like every year that I've worked at Oracle, someone has told me that the relational database is dead. Going back to 1995, when a database named Informix introduced their Illustra database.